Today's video is sponsored by HelloFresh. Hello everybody. Just recently I found myself making a lot of Aston Martin content, which I've greatly enjoyed, but long-term viewers of the channel will know that for a very long time I was actually much more closely associated with another British car brand, Lotus. And today I am asking if half a decade after I parted with my last, now is the time for another. To bring those of you who haven't been around for the last 8 years up to speed, I actually began this very channel with a video going to pick up my Lotus Evora 400, the one and only brand new car that I've ever bought, though I didn't spec it. I got it from stock. Not that much later, the Evora was then joined by the iconic Elise, a red 111R that I also had a great time with, and I even indulged in a bit of classic Lotus, buying myself not just one, but two XLs, one of which even die-hard JAYEMM fans likely don't know about because, well, it was an embarrassment. It was somebody's XL V8 conversion that I was told was really just a bit of tinkering and a service away from being ready, but in fact was nothing of the sort. It was an absolute basket case of a car, and so I think I got it, stuffed it in the back of a shed, and then about a year later sold, being very, very glad to see the back of it. Tragically, it looks like my other XL, the blue one, F110 ECK, known lovingly as Feck, also hasn't seen the road for quite some time. I think it last got an MOT in 2019. And the XL, incidentally, is a brilliant and criminally underrated car. Like many people, I've often had a bit of a lusting for an Esprit, specifically a Giugiaro Turbo Esprit, white with the black contrasting bumpers of the early cars, and if possible, a red interior with the Panasonic roof stereo. And as it happened, not that long ago on the channel, I got to drive more or less exactly that car. And it was really, really good. And just in case you're wondering what on earth it is that I find myself in currently, well, this is a Lotus Exige V6S, the third generation of the Exige that got the 3.5 litre Toyota 6-cylinder, as you saw in the Evora. This started life with about 350 horsepower, but courtesy of a Comotech upgrade, it now makes 460. Which is a lot in a car that only weighs about 1,100 kilos. I have been loaned it by the ever-lovely Vlad, a petrol-heady chap who has travelled all around, and that's why this is a left-hand drive one, because he got it when he was living in Switzerland. And he messaged me a few weeks ago to say, James, do you want to just live with my Exige for a bit? I'm going to be selling it soon, and I'm sure you'd enjoy it. And I said, well, yeah, of course, but he lives near 500 miles away from me up in Scotland. I'm down in East Anglia. And he said, yeah, that's fine. I'll drive it down. And so he did. I am a very lucky chap. The people who watch this channel and bring me stuff are extraordinary with their kindness. And so I say to Vlad and to you, thank you very much for indulging my passions over the last near decade. What was it in the first place that brought me to Lotus? Well, a combination of things. Weirdly, the Evora was always the Lotus I was kind of least fascinated by. I'd previously thought about buying an Esprit when they were about 15 grand, but realised, though I maybe could have purchased one, I couldn't have afforded to run it. The Elise and Exige, meanwhile, were certainly interesting cars, but because of what I was doing at the time, if I had a car, I would want to take it on a long trip, and that meant needing boot space, creature comforts and all that sort of thing, and the Elise and Exige don't really have much of either. This is probably about as refined and as nice as they got, and though it's quieter in here than you'd think given how Spartan the cabin is, it's yeah, not exactly luxurious. In fact, the very notion of just having to get in and then out of this car is one that did fill me with a little bit of dread because, well, I haven't gotten smaller since I last had a Lotus, and as you can probably tell, my head goes to here, or about here, and my bum is about 4 or 5 inches below the sill. So quite a bit of folding is required to get in and out of this. This being a left-hand drive car also brings with it its own issues, and for some reason getting in the left-hand side of these cars I've never found quite as easy as the right-hand side. I think it's just practice. Right-hand side of any of these, I'm in and out, no problem. Left-hand side, it's tricky. Anyway, I then wound up test driving an Evora when I had an E46 M3, my first ever drive of a Lotus, on a miserable, horrid, classic Norfolk day. And you know what? My eyes were opened. Within a few hundred yards, I suddenly got everything that people have been saying for years about how great a Lotus was. You see, I had one of the all-time greats, an E46 M3, what people will happily tell you is one of the best performance cars ever. But I never trusted it. I never really enjoyed driving it. The steering is devoid of feel and the engine's lovely and all that jazz, but it just didn't excite me. The Lotus though, I threw that round corners in a way that I just wouldn't even dare of with the M3, and that was because the car talked to me. It gave me this passion for interactive steering and a communicative chassis that stays with me to this day and really is one of the key things I look for in any car. Naturally, I will of course soon be doing a full review on this specific car, but that's not what today's video is all about. I decided to build my channel on the foundation of this love of what exactly a Lotus was, and it turns out that Lotus people all came to the brand for exactly that. Nobody bought a Lotus because they wanted to show off. Nobody bought a Lotus because they wanted to impress their neighbours. They bought them because of the way that they drove. And yes, on occasion you get people that grew up lusting after one of them. But even so, what actually made them commit was the way that car made you feel. And I said back then, and I'll still say now, that if you like the idea of a Ferrari but are put off by the running costs, and you want that sort of drama, that theatre of a car that's a little bit special, you want something that's great to drive, but you either don't want or need the speed, the running costs and all that, a Lotus is a fabulous thing. To this day, I think of buying another Evora, and really, the only reason that I haven't is that, well, it just wouldn't really fit in the current fleet. There's nothing it really does that the other cars don't. I bought the Evora because the idea of a Ferrari F430 was a million miles away. And now I've got the F430, well actually the 430, I'm very happy to say that I still think the Evora is fantastic. I always enjoyed a Lotus because of the thrill. There are other cars out there, particularly those from the likes of Porsche, where the owners will tell you their car is measurably better. And I say to them, you don't get the point of a sports car. If you want to measure your Porsche and tell me how much better it is than a Lotus, I'll go and measure a Caterham or something and tell you how much better that is. It's not what these are about. It's about you, the road, and the machine in between. And every yard I do in this, I like it that little bit more. However, the Lotus experience wasn't all sunshine and roses. And I get onto that in a little bit. But before I do, I think it's about time that I remind myself of just how good these cars can be when they're in their element, which is on a road like this. Very easy if you're into the Lotus thing to get wrapped up in all the minute differences between the many models that have been made over the years. XE's 350 Cup, 360 Cup, 380, 410, 420, 430, 390. The fact is though, they're all a bit brilliant. This is just fun. I'm not actually even going that quick. It feels very, very quick, but it's geared relatively short. This one specifically is as well. But that doesn't matter. It's about the joy you feel. I also, earlier, when I was out with Anthony doing the drive-bys in this, was reminded of one of the other things that I really, really love about owning a Lotus. That's the sense of community. Somebody went past in an Elise and they gave us a wave. If that was you, hello again. And I love that. Lotus owners are just the best. Some of them are a bit weird. You get that with every brand, I think. But the good thing about Lotus owners, the best thing maybe, is that because the brand doesn't have the same kind of appeal as Ferrari, Porsche or the like, it attracts a different crowd. They like the way that it feels. They appreciate the way that it drives. And that means that they're very open to a great number of other things. You get Honda fanboys, Nissan fanboys, BMW fanboys, and they'll be BMW for life. Their first car was a BMW, well, not always, but you get the idea. Their last car will be a BMW. Their dream car is a BMW. And if it hasn't got a blue and white roundel on the front, they're not interested. Lotus people, though, are generally pretty cool. They are interested in a great number of other cars. With the general exception of Porsche. They always have a bit of a problem with Porsches, and I think that is the sort of weird and unnecessary friction between Lotus and Porsche owners. The funny thing is that in that regard, actually, Porsche owners tend to really like the Lotus because it's the car that they probably would have had if they could have, but they talk themselves out of it, and so they respect anybody that does. The Lotus people, on the other hand, look at Porsche people and go, oh dear, you sap, you went for a 911, did you? Oh, how predictable. Bit of a shame, really. I don't think the world needs that. I've also found it quite strange, really, that outside of the world of automotive diehards, the Lotus brand is one that people know of, they've heard of, they generally have a bit of a thing for it, particularly if they're in their 50s or 60s and they can remember when Lotus was actually still winning Formula One with any regularity. Yet, mention Lotus to anybody and they'll tell you, oh yeah, lots of trouble, usually serious. And as it happens, one of the reasons I started the channel with a Lotus was I figured, you know what, I've heard all the same stories as everybody else, but I think that's probably about older cars that were made in the 70s when everything was unreliable. The new ones surely will be better, won't they? They weren't. In fact, this one was delivered to me with a check engine light that wasn't a problem because it didn't really affect the car and these things happen. However, it has since developed a traction issue, which I believe is related to the brake switch. Either it thinks the pedal's on when it's not, or vice versa. Can't remember, but anyway, it knows there's a bit of an issue. It is a matter of some very, very minor adjustment, but the downside is I think traction might be off and I can't put the car in its sport or race mode, which is why you may on occasion hear me bouncing into the RPM limiter, because in regular mode, it's 400 revs lower than it would be in sport. That's a shame. I've never actually been put off by the Toyota engine in these, because let's be honest, if you were going to have anyone build you an engine, well, you'd want Toyota to do it, wouldn't you? It's going to be reliable, it's going to be dependable. I never understood people mocking Lotus for using parts from other manufacturers. If anything on one of my Astons or the Ferrari or something breaks, I kind of hope it's off a Fiat, because that means, first off, I can get it, and secondly, I can get it relatively inexpensively. I will concede that in the 1990s, voxel indicator stalks were just about acceptable. However, come the 2020s, when Lotus were charging in excess of over £100,000 for some of these Extinguishers, 25-year-old as they were then, voxel indicator stalks, yeah, not so good. There are a lot of areas where Lotus really, really should have tried just a little bit harder. And I think that is a big problem the company had. I know it's an unpopular thing to say, but I always felt like the Elise was maybe the worst car that they could have ever made, simply because, yes, it was popular, yes, people liked it, they sold like 50-odd thousand small platform cars, that's Elise, Exige and its spin-offs, but it didn't make them any money, it didn't make them a wealthy company, it kept them going, it kept them treading water. But as time went by, the Esprit, of course, was already old and then eventually got retired. Up until the Evora landed back in the late 2000s, Well, that was all the company really made and all they were known for, and therefore everybody thought that every single Lotus was basically like an Elise. Small, cramped, noisy, lots of fun, but also not really a car you'd probably want to live with. The truth is, though, that if you know your Lotus history, you'll see that actually, that's not true at all. Look at what Colin Chapman did when he was alive. He was selling the 7. It was still a popular model, but he didn't want to be associated with kit cars. The Esprit, as it matured, became a more luxurious car. The interior became slightly more upmarket. It was clearly aimed at the sort of person that wanted a Ferrari, and in many cases, it could go toe-to-toe with Maranello's cars of the day as well. There are people out there that'll convince you that an Esprit V8 is somehow analogous to a Ferrari 360, but I love Lotus, but there's a line I have to draw, and you know what? I'm sorry, the Ferrari was a brand new car. The Esprit really felt its age. The two are so different. I did actually recently come close to buying an Esprit, a Sport 300, but in the end a few different things meant that it just wasn't going to happen. The real deal breaker being the fact that you can't get tyres for it. Full stop. They're ludicrous, like 335 section or something like that, wide tyres at the back, wider than on my F12, but 17 inches in diameter. I believe they're the only car that ever wore them, and so they're impossible to get. They just don't exist. And I don't want a car that I can't drive because the tyres are impossible to find. Takes the fun out of it, doesn't it? Especially for a car like an Esprit Sport 300 that I'm sure is so great to drive. That is one of my hero cars. I really desperately want to drive an Esprit Sport 300, and maybe I'll realise I made a terrible, terrible error. But hey-ho, I am at the end of the day simply grateful that life has afforded me a great many opportunities to drive and indeed own so many of these cars. And I can do that because I've made a lot of videos and you've kindly watched them. And one of the things that lets me make these videos is by saving a little bit of time when I'm cooking dinner. And so it is about time we mention today's sponsor, HelloFresh. You see, I know when you're watching these videos, all you really see is me out and about having a good time and driving, and that's by design. But the reality is, a lot of YouTube is slightly more boring stuff, and this means that I don't always have time for other things that I do enjoy, like cooking. Now, Lotus is a company famous for its philosophy of performance through lightweight, and this year I have taken it upon myself to adopt a little bit of that philosophy and shed a little bit of success ballast. And HelloFresh has helped me do that by counting all the calories and everything else for me, meaning that when I go home tonight and I make my delicious cheeseburger, I know exactly how many calories are in it. And I'm sure you've all heard of the HelloFresh service before, but if you haven't, now is as good a time as any to try it, and they've got a special offer for you. Scan this QR code or follow my link in the description down below and you'll get 60% off your first box from HelloFresh, 20% off the next 2 months, and additional free gifts with your orders. Now, back to the action. If you are a regular viewer of the channel, you'll have no doubt seen much of my videos recently where I've been talking about buying maybe another Aston Martin, and I've been talking about all sorts of stuff from V8 Vantages to DBS to Vanquish, and the fact is, for the amount of money that I'm talking about for any of these cars, I could happily have a Lotus of kind of any description. I could have an Elise, I could have an Extinguisher, I could have that Dream Esprit. They're not 15 grand anymore, they're more like 50, but one day, I have to have one. I do, though, worry with the Esprit specifically that they are a car that maybe, just maybe, I'm better off enjoying occasionally. Having people bring me there so I can drive it, enjoy it, and then when I'm done, say goodbye to it. Minimum hassle. Because all the people I know that have got an Esprit, especially one of that era, they tell me it's a needy car, it's a high maintenance thing. And though I'm not averse to that, got the 550 and things like that, you know, I know what these cars are like. I am wary of adding another car to the stable, particularly at this moment in time. Next year I've got to do some fairly big things financially, and I don't want to put myself in a situation where I've got another car trying to drain me. More accurately, I've got some things I need to do next year that mean anything big that I buy this year, I will have to sell. If I get another Aston, it will be, like the DB9, a temporary resident. If I get a Lotus, it will be a temporary resident. And I don't want to go and buy my dream Lotus and then sell it. I don't want to put myself in that position because I'll want to keep it. I'll want to keep it forever. An Evora, though, something like that I could happily have, although they are slow sellers. I've not yet mentioned the Emira, and that's a car I enjoyed. I also saw the other day that they now do a Chapman Bespoke, awful name, but whatever, service for the car. So you can now have it in different colours, different specifications, and all that sort of stuff. I'm sure for a lot more money than they used to ask, but then they probably asked not enough back in the day. I do have an open letter with my preferred Lotus dealer, Bell & Colville, down in Surrey, that if they do a final edition of the Emira, and I can customise it, I would like to buy one. Half of this problem has clearly been solved, but will they do a final edition V6? I don't know. It also would appear that Lotus, unfortunately, haven't really learned a lot, because from all the people I've spoken to that have got Emiras, they've had a lot of issues, many of which are the same as those faced by Evora owners. And considering the platform now is, what, a decade and a half old, that just shouldn't be happening. Lotus is a company that's supposed to have loads and loads of money in it, and yet they're, for the old school customer, flagship product, the Emira, they just don't seem to have spent anywhere near enough. In fact, the more I watch what is happening at Lotus, the less I kind of recognise it. And I'm not a stick in the mud. I am perfectly aware that the company could not survive on Elise, Exige and Evora alone. But it did need, to me, an Esprit. It did need a supercar, a proper one that people could go and buy, not an electric thing. It didn't need the Evija, it didn't need that. I mean, has anybody bought one? I'm sure some people have, but I don't know. And as for the Electra and the Emea, or whatever it's called, they look like perfectly decent cars, but if I want a dirty, great big electric SUV, I can buy that from any number of firms. And the fact is, if I was going to go and buy an SUV now, I'd probably just go and buy a Bentayga for about 60 grand, and then I'd have a Bentley and not a Lotus. I appreciate that Lotus does need these new products. I appreciate that Porsche requires the Cayenne, and without that and the Macan, the 911 GT3 couldn't exist. I get it. But I do get the feeling that Geely bought Lotus simply with the intention of using the badge. They wanted one that's going to be recognisable to Western audiences, hold a bit of cachet, so that they can chuck stuff out with a badge on that people will recognise. I don't think they actually care in the least about their old customers. And I did hear one chap who was somewhat involved with the factory say to me that they now referred to the older customers, which included people like him, as bubble hats, for the, classic hat you wear when you're driving a British sports car in the cold with the roof off. Although it's actually a weirdly accurate term, because I can see the image in my head, it's also quite derogatory, and I think unnecessary. It's a shame, really. And I suppose I should probably mention something else that is actually rather important, which is that though Lotus customers, Lotus owners, they are the best, they're lovely, they're really nice, and I have an awful lot to thank them for. The Lotus factory has never been anything other than absolute misery to work with. Now, this is not a universal statement. This would be unfair to apply to everybody that works or has worked there. There are a whole bunch of people there dedicated to both the brand and its loyal followers who, honestly, Lotus don't deserve. They really, really don't. These are people who give the company so much and get so little back. You should be thanking these people. You should be saying to them, you were here for us in our darkest hour. Now we've got money. What can we do? How do we do things right? How do we make this company one that everybody can love? One for old and new customers. But they just don't care. Now, some of these people have been at the company for an awfully long time, and I take absolutely zero pleasure whatsoever in saying that Lotus's PR department and me, we don't get on. At all. I've pulled them up on a few things, both historically and in more recent times. Case in point, the Emira, where they said that it was an all-new car, when it is clear to anybody with a set of eyes that it's not. It's an Evora chassis with a different body and different interior. I don't understand the need to constantly lie about these things. You could tell that a few years ago Lotus got a new boss in, and when he arrived, Lotus up until that point had been extraordinarily accurate with all of the weight figures for their cars. And for a company whose motto was light is right, you'd hope that they knew how to use a set of scales. But, sorry, small boys going past, they asked, it's community service. However, when this boss arrived, and they said they'd stripped even more weight out of these cars, I did a little bit of digging and I found out that my Evora 400, which on their website they said was some 42 kilos lighter than the car it replaced, was actually heavier by quite a bit. And then I found out, having done a bit more digging, that all the kilos the car had lost, they didn't lose in the engineering department, they lost in the marketing department. That's just not right at all on any level, especially for a company whose whole philosophy is based around lightweight. I didn't like that. It even got to the point where they started using different standards for measuring their cars to make it appear like they'd lost more weight than they had. One would be measured wet, one would be measured dry, and they didn't even understand what dry weight actually meant, because to them it was just the car without any fuel in it. That's not what dry weight is. When I sold my Evora, I had absolutely no intention whatsoever of stopping making Lotus content, because I really loved the brand, and for all of the failings that the company had, it didn't bother me. I had plenty of Lotus dealers that I got on with perfectly well. They supplied me with the cars, I made content, everything was right with the world. And even today I get an email from people every now and again saying, oh, by the way, I've just bought an Exige, an Elise, an Evora or something, and your videos were helpful, despite the fact I haven't really made any for years. And because I didn't want people to think that I'd abandoned Lotus, as soon as I knew that I was going to sell the Evora, I made plans to try and film a whole bunch more content on Lotus stuff. And then I found out that a memo had gone around to all the dealers saying that no cars were to be given to anybody for review from a dealer. And though it didn't specifically name me, the fact was there wasn't anybody else out there that I could see regularly making Lotus content. I then phoned them up to ask what on earth was going on, and was then told that simultaneously, because I'd said a few things that were negative, I was harming the brand, but that also the channel wasn't big enough and people didn't listen to me, and I wasn't worth giving a car to. I can never work out which that was. Was I a small nothing channel, or was I a channel that people listened to? I don't know. I may sound a little bit bitter about that, and the fact is I'm still a tiny bit bitter about it, but I've gotten on with plenty of other much larger, much more successful companies, given them a hard time. I mean, let's be honest here. If you were to think of a company that didn't like me, it's McLaren, isn't it? McLaren have never said anything to me. Never, ever, never had an email, never had a phone call, nothing. They have never, ever even suggested to me that they were upset with me. I'm sure they are. I'm sure they were quietly seething for quite some time, but they left it alone. Lotus, though, no. They made it very personal, and the people who did that, last check, were still there. And that's unfortunate. And it shouldn't be like that. This shouldn't be a factor. And if I was going to go and buy, say, an old Esprit or something like that, I don't think it would be. And if I was going to buy an Evora, I don't think it would be. But I remember what misery it was trying to get spare parts for stuff like the Evora when it was a car still in production. Now, years later, they don't build them anymore. I'm certainly not particularly welcome at Hethel. I just started to think, well, I've got to think from a content perspective here. I would love to own the car, I'd have a great time, but they weren't easy to own. And though my Ferraris certainly do break, when they break I can get the parts for them. If I can't get the parts, that's a big issue. However, I then drop a cog, put my foot down, and I go, it doesn't matter. I feel a bit better now. I know I've had a bit of a whinge and a moan and a whine and everything, but honestly, any and every Lotus owner will tell you that if you're going to buy one, that's kind of what it's like. It will be elation and then abject depression. And I think on balance, my Lotus cars always gave me far more joy than sorrow, with the exception of the XL V8, but that really is not Lotus' fault. And so maybe one day there'd be another one. But which? I'm leaning towards getting that Dream Turbo Esprit. But if I did, would you watch content on that? So, what should I get? Hit the comment section down below and let me know. If you haven't already, make sure to give the video a like, and if you have made it this far and you're still one of the 71% of viewers that hasn't subscribed, it'd mean an awful lot to me if you could tick that button as well. And because you've been so good and you've made it to the end of this video, I'm going to give you what some might consider a treat. You're always asking me how I get in and out of cars. And the fact is, I know I'm not slender, I'm not stupid. But for most, not really an issue. Height is far greater a problem than weight. A Lotus, though, well, they're a bit different. So, here we go for your viewing pleasure. JM gets out of a Lotus Extinguisher. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.